ended the previous segment with Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World, which describes a world ruled with the help of psychiatric drugs. Everyone in this world is very happy all the time because everyone takes drugs all the time. Most readers feel there is something very wrong with that kind of world, but it is hard to say exactly what, because everyone are so happy, so what's wrong with it? The problem has to do with the definition of happiness. In Huxley's world, happiness is defined in biological terms simply as pleasure. To be happy is no more and more less than to experience pleasant bodily sensations more and more of the time. Since our normal biochemistry, our normal biochemical system limits the volume and the duration of these pleasant sensations in the body, the only way to make people experience a high level of happiness over an extended periods of time is to manipulate the biochemical system with the help of drugs and other medical treatments. This indeed is a direction in which our world today is progressing, not in some science fiction fantasy, but in the real world. And it's progressing in that direction in a very fast rate. But the definition of happiness as pleasure, which is common today in science, in our society, is not accepted by all scholars or by all people. In a very famous study, Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, he studied, amongst other things, what causes people happiness. And he asked people to recount a typical work day, it's an unusual day, to recount it, to tell what happened to them on that day in great detail, going through it episode by episode, and evaluating how much they enjoyed or disliked each of them. He did one of these studies on 900 and something women in Texas from the working class. He asked each of these women to break up her day, a typical day, into segments, into episodes of 2, 3, 5 minutes, write what she is doing each 5 minutes, and also write how much she enjoyed or disliked what she did. So you had these long stories, long diaries that I talked on the phone with a friend, and then I took a bus to work, and then I had to wait for the bus, and then I was on the bus, and then at work the boss yelled at me, and I went back home, and I watched TV, and I did the laundry, and so forth and so on. And about each of these small episodes, she also wrote how much she enjoyed or disliked it. And what turned out is that the episode that these women, on average, disliked most, or some of the things that they disliked most, was the taking care of their children. Most of their contact, most of their activities which were concerned with their children were rated as the least joyful activities of the day, like changing diapers and doing the washing the dirty clothes and preparing food for them, and having to deal with temper tantrums and children fighting and yelling at each other. This was the least enjoyable part of every day. They even preferred, according to the grades they gave, they even find more joy at work than being with their children at home. Now, he also asked these women to write in general terms what are the things that contribute most to their happiness. And most of them said that their children are their chief source of happiness, even though their actual contact with their children, not all the activities, but most of the activities were rated as the least enjoyable. So how to explain this discrepancy? That in general, in theory, these women say, my children, this is the source of my happiness. But when you actually look at her interaction with the children, most of the things that she does, like again changing diapers or preparing breakfast or separating kids screaming at each other, she doesn't like it. So why does she say that this is the chief source of her happiness? Now, there are two ways in which scholars understand these results. One school of thought, one option, is that people, not only these women in Texas, but people in general, just don't really know what's good for them. They think that one thing is the source of their happiness, perhaps because society told them that this is what the source of happiness, but it's not true. When you actually look at events from close up, it doesn't fulfill these expectations. Another option is that what Kahneman studied and other such studies discovered is that happiness is simply something different from pleasure. Happiness is not the surplus of pleasant moments over unpleasant moments. Rather, happiness consists in seeing one's life in its entirety as meaningful and worthwhile. There is a very important cognitive and ethical component to happiness. Our values is what makes the difference in the way that we see ourselves. Our values make the difference between seeing ourselves as miserable slaves to a baby dictator and seeing ourselves as lovingly nurturing a new life, in how you relate to this job of raising children. And these scholars argue that a meaningful life, activities in which you find meaning, can be extremely satisfying even if they are not easy, even if they are hard, even if they are not joyful very much. Whereas a meaningless life, activities in which you don't find any meaning, can be a terrible ordeal, even if it is very, very comfortable. Again, to take another example, it's like somebody who goes to climb the Everest or goes on a very difficult trek. It's not comfortable. Most of the things he or she will experience will be difficult things. It's much easier to stay at home, sit on the sofa and watch TV. However, if this person finds meaning in this ambition to climb the Everest or some other high mountain, he may reflect upon this entire chapter of his life as being a very happy period, the time when I climbed the Everest. Much happier than the time when I sat at home on the comfortable sofa and watched TV. Why? Because happiness isn't comfort, and happiness isn't pleasure. Happiness, above all, is finding meaning in what we do, even if what we do involves a lot of hardships and difficulties, and it's not rosy and joyful all the time. This approach has important implications for the history of happiness. People in all cultures and eras have probably felt the same type of pleasant and unpleasant sensations in their body. But the meaning that people gave to their experiences might have been very different in different cultures and periods of history. If so, then the history of happiness might have been far more turbulent than what biologists imagine. It's not a straight line that everybody always had relatively the same levels of happiness because pleasure and unpleasant sensation in the body remains the same. No, if meaning has an important impact on happiness, then there could be huge differences between the meanings that people in different cultures find to their lives. And if this is true, this implies that life in the modern age is not necessarily better, happier than life in previous eras like the Middle Ages. If you look at life minute by minute, activity by activity, and judge how hard it is or how easy it is, then certainly life in the Middle Ages for most people was much more hard, much more difficult, much less comfortable than life is today, at least for people in affluent societies. However, if happiness depends on meaning, then still, medieval people could have been even happier than people today in affluent societies. Because medieval people, say in Europe, they could find meaning to everything that happens in their lives in the promise of everlasting bliss in the afterlife and of their being part of this huge cosmic plan of God, of the Creator God. So everything that happens to me, it might be difficult, but it's full of meaning. In contrast to these medieval people who had a very meaningful life, modern secular people in affluent societies, they may have a very comfortable life, but for many of them it's meaningless. In the long run, in the long term, they can expect nothing except complete and meaningless oblivion. There is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no cosmic plan. Everything that happens to me is simply unimportant and meaningless. So if you ask how comfortable life is, then yes, life today is far more comfortable. But if you ask people, how satisfied are you with your life? And how meaningful is your life? Then people in the Middle Ages, despite all the difficulties, might have been in an equal situation, even a better situation, than people today. The problem, so this is another approach to the history of happiness. It gives a lot of importance to meaning, much more than to pleasant sensations and comforts. And from this perspective, it turns out that life today is not necessarily much more happy, much more meaningful than in the past. The problem with this approach, however, is that from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. According to science, at least to science in the early 21st century, humans, just like all other phenomena in the world, humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without any purpose, without any goal, without any meaning. Our actions, our lives, are not part of some divine cosmic plan. If planet Earth would blow up tomorrow morning with all the humans and elephants and giraffes on it, then the rest of the universe will probably keep going about its business as usual. It wouldn't change anything to the universe that the whole Earth with all its people disappeared, blew up. And according to modern science today, any meaning that people ascribe to their lives and their decisions and their actions is simply a delusion. We are deluding ourselves. We think we have meaning what we don't. All these religious meanings, otherworldly meanings that medieval people found to their lives, they were delusions. And similarly, the meaning that modern people try to find to their lives, the humanist, the nationalist, the capitalist meanings of the lives of modern people, they too are just delusions. Today, scientists may say that my life is meaningful because I increase the store of human knowledge. A soldier may say that my life is meaningful because I fight to defend the homeland. A business person might say that my life is meaningful because I'm building a new and successful company. But these are all delusions. Just like medieval people who thought that their lives had meaning in reading scriptures or going on crusade or building a cathedral. And now we look back and we say they are just deluding themselves. So the same is true about the lives of people today. The conclusion of this line of thinking is that if the key to happiness is to have meaning in your life, then the real key to happiness is to synchronize your personal delusions of meaning with the prevailing collective delusions. There is no meaning in the world, but as long as my personal story is in line with the stories of the people around me, then I can convince myself that my life is meaningful and thereby find happiness and satisfaction. And this is a pretty depressing conclusion. It implies that happiness, that having happiness, that being happy, depends on self-delusion and on the fact that nobody will come from outside and destroy your delusions. So this is a pretty depressing conclusion. So far we've seen that if happiness depends on feeling pleasant sensations, then in order to be happier, we need to re-engineer our biochemical system. If happiness is based on feeling that life is meaningful, then in order to be happier, we need to delude ourselves more effectively. Is there perhaps another way of understanding happiness? One alternative that receives growing attention from scholars of happiness is the Buddhist view of happiness. Buddhism assigned the question of happiness more importance than perhaps any other religion in history. The main question of monotheist religions is, given that God exists, what does He want from me? In contrast, the main question of Buddhism is, given that suffering exists, how do I get liberated from suffering and enjoy happiness? Therefore, for the last 2,500 years, Buddhists have systematically studied the essence and causes of happiness, which is why there is a growing interest among the scientific community in Buddhism, both in Buddhist philosophy and in Buddhist meditation practices. For example, today, brain scientists are taking Buddhist monks and ask them to sit in the laboratory and meditate, and they connect them to all kinds of electrodes and brain scanners and scan their brains to see what happens when these monks meditate. There's a lot of researches of this kind going around today. Buddhism shares the basic insight of the biological approach to happiness, namely that happiness results from processes occurring within one's body and not from events happening in the outside world. So this is something very similar in Buddhism and in the biological approach to happiness. However, starting from the same insight, Buddhism reaches very different conclusion. According to Buddhism, most people identify happiness with the pleasant sensations and feelings in their body, while identifying suffering with unpleasant feelings. People consequently ascribe immense importance to what they feel. People crave to experience more and more pleasures, while avoiding as much as possible pain and unpleasant feelings. Whatever people do, whatever we do throughout our lives, whether we scratch our leg or we move slightly in the chair or we fight world wars, whatever we do, we are just trying to get pleasant feelings. The problem, according to Buddhism, is that our feelings are no more than fleeting vibrations, changing every moment like the waves in the ocean. If 5 minutes ago I felt very joyful and purposeful, now these feelings from 5 minutes ago, they are gone. And I might well feel sad and dejected. So if I want to experience pleasant feelings, I have to constantly chase them while constantly driving away the unpleasant feelings. Even if I succeed, I immediately have to start all over again without ever getting any lasting reward for all my troubles, because these pleasant feelings from 5 minutes ago, they are gone. I have again and again and again to chase them and to get them. What then, asks Buddhism, what is so important about obtaining such ephemeral prizes? Why struggle so hard throughout our lives to achieve something that disappears almost as soon as it arises? These vibrations, these feelings. According to Buddhism, the root of suffering is not the feeling of pain, and not the feeling of sadness, and not even the feeling of meaninglessness. Rather, according to Buddhism, the real root of suffering is this never-ending and pointless pursuit of ephemeral feelings, which causes us to be in a constant state of tension, of restlessness, and dissatisfaction. Because of this pursuit of pleasant feelings, our mind is never satisfied with reality as it is. Even when we experience something pleasant, some pleasant feeling, we are not content because our mind fears that this feeling might soon disappear, and we crave that this feeling should stay and intensify. People are liberated from suffering not when they experience this or that fleeting pleasure which immediately disappears, but rather people are liberated from suffering when they understand the impermanent nature of all their feelings and therefore stop craving them and chasing them. And this is the aim of Buddhist meditation practices. In meditation, you're supposed to closely observe your own mind and body, to witness for yourself the ceaseless arising and passing of all your feelings, and thereby to realize how pointless it is to chase after them, to pursue them. And when the pursuit stops, the mind becomes very relaxed, very clear, very satisfied. All kinds of feelings still go on arising and passing. There is still joy and anger and boredom and lust that arise and pass. But once you stop craving to have particular feelings, then you can accept whatever comes. You can accept whatever feelings that comes, just watching it coming and going without losing your head over them. The resulting serenity, according to the Buddhist view, the resulting serenity is so profound that people who go on living their lives in a frenzied pursuit of pleasant feelings can hardly even begin to imagine what it is like to be outside of this pursuit. Now, this idea is so alien to modern Western culture that when Western New Age movements encountered Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist meditation and all these Buddhist insights, they turned them upside down, turned them on their head. New Age cults frequently argue that happiness does not depend on external conditions in the outside world. Happiness depends only on what we feel inside. So people should stop pursuing external achievements such as wealth and beauty and status, and instead connect with their inner feelings. Or, as many New Age cults put it in brief, happiness begins within. Now, this is exactly what biologists argue, but it is more or less opposite of what Buddha said. Buddha agreed with modern biology and with modern New Age movements that happiness is independent of external conditions. Yet, his more important and far more profound insight was that true happiness is also independent of our inner feelings. Indeed, the more significance that we give our inner feelings, the more we crave for them and the more we suffer. The basic recommendation of Buddhism is not merely to slow down the pursuit of external achievements, but above all, to slow down the pursuit of inner feelings. If we accept this view of happiness, then our entire understanding of the history of happiness might be misguided. Maybe it isn't so important whether people enjoy pleasant feelings and whether people feel that their life has meaning. The main question is whether people understand the truth about the nature of their feelings. And what evidence do we have that people today in the 21st century understand this truth any better than ancient foragers or medieval peasants? So this is the Buddhist view. Now, this is not the time and place to try to judge between all these different approaches to happiness. Scholars began the scientific study of happiness only a few years ago, and we are still just formulating initial theories and searching for the appropriate research methods. It's much too early to jump to conclusions and to end the debate before it hardly even began. What is important at this stage is to get to know as many different approaches to happiness as possible and to remember to ask the right questions. Most history books focus on the ideas of great thinkers, on the bravery of warriors, on the charity of saints, on the creativity of artists. Most history books, however, have much to tell us about social structures, about the rise and fall of empires, about the invention and spread of technology. But they have much less to tell us, most history books, about how all this have influenced the suffering and the happiness of individuals. And this is the biggest lacuna, the biggest hole in our understanding of history. We don't really know how all this impacted happiness in the world. So we had better start filling this hole, because without knowing this, we can't say that we actually understand history. And with this thought, we end our journey through the human past, from the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago to the present. During these 70,000 years, a lot of things happened. We are just not sure whether it was all good or bad. But there is still one more subject which we need to address before terminating this course, A Brief History of Humankind. And this subject is the future. We have talked a lot about the past, but history also includes the future. In the next and last lesson of the course, we will try to say something about the likely future of humankind.